Very few movie moguls working today can say that they built a major studio from scratch, but one who can is Robert Shaye, founder of New Line Cinema, the house that Freddy built, which also would pioneer the comic book movie genre with releases such as Blade, The Mask, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and make history by filming the 3 Lord of the Rings movies back to back. Born in Detroit, Michigan, Robert Shaye earned a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Michigan and a JD degree from Columbia Law School. He also graduated from the University of Stockholm, Sweden as a Fulbright scholar. In 1967, Shaye formed New Line Cinema. The company started with a package of feature films and shorts rented to colleges. From there, New Line expanded to re-releases such as Reefer Madness and first-run domestic distribution of foreign films. Although probably best known for the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, New Line Cinema has also released movies such as Dumb and Dumber, Seven, Boogie Nights, Rush Hour, and the Austin Powers and Final Destination film series, to name but a few. Because over the course of his career, Shaye has, in a variety of capacities, been involved with the production of more than 600 movies. In addition to having worked as both an actor, producer, and director at different times, Shaye is a member of the New York State Bar Association, and he has served on the Board of Trustees for the Neurosciences Institute, the Legal Aid Society, the American Film Institute, and the Will Rogers Motion Pictures Pioneers Foundation. Midnight's Edge, represented by Tom Connors and myself, is deeply honored to be able to talk about films and filmmaking with Bob Shaye.
I'm glad to be here and glad to speak to you gentlemen. I'm happy and impressed and really excited to talk to a fan base and to hear from you guys who both validate one of the industries I've been in for a long time, but it's a little bit more about the fascination of movie making. And if you can create a movie that evokes an emotion, whether it's a smile, a tear, or a shriek, that to me is a movie well made. Of course, there's other kinds of movies, but I've always been interested in movies as a stimulus to emotion.
The pleasure to have you here is all ours, and what I find so fascinating with your extensive resume is all of the different things that you have done within filmmaking, not just directing, not just producing, but even founding companies. So let's go back to the beginning and start with that. You founded New Line in 1967. How did that come about?
Came about because since I was a very young man, actually, just into my teens, I was interested in movie making. And actually, I wanted to be an actor at the beginning, is the truth I will now admit. And I began to suspect that I really wasn't very good at it, even though I rather liked it, but that I had some faults in my personality that prevented me from being a really good actor. And certainly, some of the reviewers and the viewers who saw my acting agreed with me that I wasn't very good. So with that, I was always interested, again, since I was a little boy, in photography. And so I ended up picking up a camera that my dad had and started to make little movies when I was 14 years old. This was in the 50s. At the urging of my father, when I graduated business school, I decided to go to law school. The thing I most liked of the courses that I took was copyright law, because it was all about storytelling and how you protected intellectual property and things like that. When I was in my last year in law school, a friend of mine called me up and said, you know, you are the photographer in the Detroit area. I was from Detroit, Michigan. And you are taking pictures of everybody and making money as a photographer at school dances and things like that, wedding pictures. But there's another guy who's making movies and he's doing very well. So I said, what is his name? He said, his name is Bryan De Palma. And Bryan is dating a girl that we went to high school with in Detroit. So I felt very jealous of Bryan, and I decided that I was going to make a short film myself that was going to compete with Bryan De Palma for a prize that he won that was called the Rosenthal Prize for the best short film by a filmmaker under the age of 25. And at that time I was 24 and I was just finishing law school, and I finished the film just 2 days before I turned 25 years old. And I submitted the film to the committee to be judged, and they had called me up and they said, you won the prize. prize for the best film by a filmmaker under the age of 25, best short film. And I was very excited. And then the guy said, but by the way, I have to tell you that you have to share the prize with a guy named Marty Scorsese. I said, okay, if that's the rules, I'll share the prize with him. So Marty and I shared the prize for our respective films in that year. And that was sort of how I got started. But then I had this film and I didn't know exactly what to do with it, but I decided I had to try to get it distributed somehow. And I went to distributors and I looked around and I was asking everybody. And even though it won some more prizes at some of the other festivals and things like that, I couldn't find anybody who wanted to distribute the movie. Well, my dad was in the wholesale grocery business, which is a distribution business. So I knew about being a distributor. And even though I didn't much like it, I knew how to do it and I knew how important it was to get something that you made out into the public. So it was with that I decided to start a distribution myself that distributed films to colleges and universities.
So it started with distributing your own movie, but you soon started distributing other movies as well. How did the company progress from that first beginning to up to the point where you actually started producing your own movies a decade later?
I had a lot of friends who were making movies. So I found a Danish film that was called Sommerkrig, which means Summer War. And I decided to try to distribute feature films and also have short films with them, and then to make a whole program out of it. So my girlfriend and I made program notes that we called Seymour, you get the pun. And we had notes about the filmmakers, and we distributed as our first 4 films, 2 Czech films, one by Jan Nemec and one by Jan Schmidt, and a documentary called Witch of Positano that was directed by Sheldon Rocklin, and a Canadian film called The Virgin President. And with each of those 4 films, we put 2 short films to go with them. And of course, one of them was my short film. And we made up program notes, and we made trailers, and we made posters, and we got some of the best commercial artists in the country who just happened to be living in New York and who were sympathetic to young filmmakers to do posters for us. And we provided the school with posters and trailers and advertisements they could put in the school newspapers and the films. We rented the films to the student activities departments as money-making events for universities. And that was how Blue Line started in 1967.
Wow. So then eventually you decided to produce full-fledged feature films. What got you to that point?
Well, it was what I always wanted to do. The truth was what I really wanted to do was to direct myself, but nobody was hiring me. And I didn't want to go to Los Angeles and get into the middle of that whole thing. And some of my friends, like Bryan and others, did go to Los Angeles and made a career for themselves. But I decided to stay in New York. The trouble was I didn't have any money, and I didn't know how to raise money, and I never had raised money. These 4 films that I got and all the short films, everybody just made a deal with me for 50-50. We split everything, and I was honest and gave the filmmakers what they were entitled to. But there wasn't very many films that were available that I could just get on a 50-50, cooperative basis. So we needed some money, and we didn't have any, and it was a very rocky road for a while. Reefer Madness, I discovered, was in the public domain. I figured that out from law school, and so I managed to get that film for nothing almost. And that helped us along for a while, but we never really had any money. And eventually I started hiring guys that had just come out of college to be my representatives, to be the representatives of New Line. And they went to the colleges around where they were located and sold these programs, these New Line programs, to the various colleges. And I was convinced by one of these special salesmen, who's still a friend of mine, that I would be crazy not to go to Cannes and try to find films there, because we needed product, we didn't have anything, and there must be some films that were going to be good that students would want to see. So I went to Cannes one year, just staying in a little hotel somewhere, and didn't have any contacts, didn't know what I was doing. But I had lived in Europe for a couple of years, and so I wasn't afraid of international commerce, but I was totally not a part of any community there whatsoever. But I did see that there was all of these kind of crazy antics that went on the street called the Croisette, and where people were hawking their films. And I met a guy who was a stuntman. And we were sitting having coffee one day, and I said, "Tell me about what you do." And he said, "Oh, stunt." And I learned all about what stuntmen do. They don't just do everything. Some guys do horse tricks. Some guys do high fall tricks. Some guys do fighting. And there's all kinds of different sorts of stuntmen. So I came up with this idea to do a film about a murder mystery about stuntmen making a movie that was called Stunts. We hired Mark Lester, who made a couple of movies and used to be running the film program at the University of California at Berkeley and rented our films. It was just a young filmmaker, and he became the director. And we raised money the way independent people had just started to do. We had a bunch of drawings from the action parts of the script. We took to Cannes the next year, and we showed them to different distributors who came to Cannes looking for material. And we talked a few of them into giving us letters of credit that when we delivered the film, they would pay us a certain amount of money. And we found a bank to finance the letters of credit. And it was the whole sort of like right at the beginning of the way independent films got going. And we ended up getting the $700,000 or $800,000 that was the budget at that time for making Stunts. So we made Stunts, and we brought it to Cannes the next year, and it was a huge success, and everybody bought it. And we did the same thing that other guys do. We hired a stuntman, a French stuntman, and we set him on fire, and we had him run down the Croisette and run to the beach, and then he swam into the water to put out the fire, and then an airplane picked him up and dropped him on a boat, and then he sailed away. And we sold out almost all the territories for this movie. It was very much in the real, true independent spirit. The major companies didn't know who we were, didn't care about us, and thought we were just a nuisance. But we had all the other independent companies in Europe and in Asia. We had a guy from Indonesia gave us a letter of credit. And anyhow, we managed to put it together. It was kind of insane. And we had a great cast. Frankly, I thought it was great with Fiona Lewis and Ray Sharkey and Robert Forster and a lot of names that are still around and some of whom have died. And the film was not particularly successful at the box office, but we sold it to NBC as a movie of the week, and it was called Who's Killing the Stuntmen? And it was kind of a success. And so that sort of launched our filmmaking career. And frankly, as I tell the story, I still get a little thrill and a little chill recalling all of the troubles and the people I had to put up with, and the money came and it didn't come, and what was going to come, and I don't know. But it was all done with love, sincerity, and Mark Lester did a great job, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I managed. So that was the beginning of our production career.
And an excellent beginning it was. And that also paved the way for future movies, like Alone in the Dark and Extro. Can you talk about those?
Well, Alone in the Dark was written and directed by a guy named Jack Shoulder, who is still a good friend of mine. He came to work for us as a secretary initially. He had just graduated from college. We had a little loft on 13th Street and University Place downtown. And then he said he was an editor, and he edited some of the trailers for us. And then one day he wrote a script and he brought it to us called Alone in the Dark. At that point in time, we had moved on and actually had gotten some money together from a group of bankers because there was something called this. There still is something called the Small Business Administration that the government gave support to financiers who wanted to finance small businesses, and we qualified. So they gave us some money to make Alone in the Dark, and Jack had wrote and directed, and it was also reasonably successful. Extro was brought to us by a guy named Mark Forstatter, who I met because he was one of the producers of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I wanted that film so bad to distribute, I would have licked their shoes. But anyhow, they ended up giving it to Don Rugoff, who owned Cinema 5 theaters in New York, who was our big competition and always beat us every time because he had money and he had reputation and we were nobody. But Mark and I got to be friends. He brought us the script called Extro, which was a science fiction horror film. And the guy who wrote and directed was a kind of a goofy English guy, Harry Davenport. And Harry was a bit of a crazy guy, but he raised some money from some, I think, Australians or someplace like that. And we made Extro, which was also a little science fiction horror film, as I said, and just followed the rules and, got us that much further along our way.
So how did the relationship with John Waters start? Did you know him before you guys started distributing his movies? Or
when we were looking for properties, a lot of the American underground filmmakers like Ron Rice and we were getting films from independent guys who were just like me, who were trying to find somebody to distribute their movie. And I received a film from this guy named John Waters, who I had never met. And he said, I just made this film called Multiple Maniacs. So I looked at the film and I really just didn't get it. I mean, I had a very open mind, but this was just like, I just didn't get it at all. So I wrote the guy back and I said, John, a well-intentioned work, but I don't know how we could distribute this. But if you do anything that's a little bit more, in your mind, commercial, please stay in touch with me. And at this time, the Elgin Theater in New York, Ben Barenholtz had taken it over as manager, and they were showing midnight shows, and they had a midnight show. And we said, well, we ought to find something that we can show at midnight, too. And in fact, Ben Barenholtz, he gave our very first theatrical release with Martyrs of Love, which was one of the 4 films in our first collection. In any event, after I sent John back his film, about 6 months later, I get another 16 millimeter fiber container, which has a 16 millimeter film in it from John. He said, well, try this one. It's called Pink Flamingos. And I said, okay. We had a 16 millimeter projector and we had a screen and we had an empty room. And so I put it on the projector and I could not believe what I had seen. I was so surprised that I actually, at one scene, actually stopped the projector and ran it backwards to be sure that I had seen what I had seen. And sure enough, I had definitely seen what I had seen. This was way before anybody was doing anything with optical effects or anything like that. And I just said, this is too much. I saw the end of it, called John and said, you got a deal. We're going to distribute this film. And that's how John and I began a really long-term relationship. We produced, I think, 6 of his films over the years, and we're still great buddies. And Pink Flamingos was our first midnight show, and we showed it at the Elgin Theater, too. There was this huge crowd that came out at midnight. Everybody was smoking dope, completely out of their minds. And some of them were already dressed up because they'd seen the film 2 or 3 times. But one of the scenes that I caught was one of the guys coming out of the movie theater. I stopped him. I said, excuse me, sir, what did you think of this movie? He said, are you kidding? He said, John Waters is a genius. He has his thumb on the pulse of American youth, and he has his finger deep up their ass. And
you were so much ahead of your time with the independent films. You were so much ahead of your time with, John Waters and all that kind of stuff. And that would, of course, lead to Nightmare on Elm Street. Tell us how you got from John Waters to there.
Mark Forstater actually said to me at one point, you can't just sit here in New York waiting for people to send you underground movies. They weren't called independent cinema then. It was called underground movies. And I said, well, I know that, and that they're not making that much money anyhow. So he said, well, you have to go to Los Angeles and meet some of the young filmmakers. So we went to Los Angeles together, and I met Tobe Hooper and Joe Dante. And I couldn't actually reach Wes Craven to meet him, but he finally sort of deigned to pick up the phone. And I said, we've started this distribution company and we've got some really exciting stuff. And I said, do you have anything that, that might be of interest to us? And he said, well, I'm working on this script about a boogeyman who comes to you in your nightmares, but instead of waking up, you can't wake up and he kills you in your dreams. So I said, well, that's fantastic, man. It really is exciting because to me, this idea, the marketing idea was so pre-sold because everybody understood what nightmares are about. And instead of having to educate the audience about what the film is going to be about, you already knew that it's about nightmares. And this scary guy was going to do something. And so you were really part of the involved audience just by reading the ad or hearing about the movie. But he refused to send me the script. And eventually, after I called him 4 or 5 times, I came back from Los Angeles. Everybody had turned the project down. And as sort of a last ditch, I guess I might as well try anything thing. He sent me the script. And I really loved it. I thought it was great, as any producer would. I knew it needed some work, but I thought that was really kind of genius. So we ended up making a deal for the option for the movie. And then we went about trying to raise the money to make it happen. And in the meantime, Wes did something that was quite brilliant. He actually created the first quipping monster. He came up with a manifestation that was a jokester at the same time, or was a really cynical, sardonic monster. And that was obviously one of the really incredibly effective things that made Nightmare on Elm Street so incredible. And along with that, what I didn't really expect, and I wasn't really even a big fan of propagating, was that there was clearly a lot of possible sequels after this. The film that was our first really big success, along with Reefer Madness and Sympathy for the Devil, which was another one. But they were few and far between. But when we had Nightmare on Elm Street, we knew that we could move ahead. And so who, for the second movie, because Wes turned down doing a sequel, did I choose but Jack Shoulder to direct.
Now, just to go back real quick, you said that when you got the script, you loved it, of course, but you said you knew it needed a little work. What changed from that script to the final film that sticks out in your mind the most?
Well, one of the things about that particular series is that I drew from my own nightmares and incorporated them into the film. The making of the film was the real nightmare, but that's another story, and I won't tell you that one right now. But the one particular that I remember was what we call the sticky stair scene, where Nancy is trying to get away from Freddy Krueger, and she goes to run up the stairs, and the stairs turn into sort of like just a kind of muck, and her feet get caught in it, and that's when Freddy Krueger almost grabs her before she managed to get out. Since that was my idea, that was one that I remember vividly. And actually, Wes, in his desperation, although he was desperately afraid also that I was going to try to take over directing the movie, which I had no intention of doing, he let me direct that little scene because we only had one night to finish the whole movie, and the DP was ready to walk with the entire crew because, I don't know, we were working them too hard or we didn't pay them or something. I don't remember what it was. And so we had to do everything. We had like 4 or 5 different sets shooting all at the same time, and the assistant cameraman, and everybody was just trying to finish the film. So that's one scene that I remember. Otherwise, another thing about that movie, which is pretty interesting, is we didn't know how to end the movie. Well, Wes had one point of view about it, and I had another. Wes's point of view narratively was fine, which was Nancy wakes up, the sun is shining, she goes outside and goes to school, her mother says goodbye, Ronnie Blakely says goodbye, and she goes off and goes to school. And I had seen Friday the 13th. There's always a kind of like a scare at the end of the movie to get people to come back, and also to remember what the movie was all about. And I said, you can't do that. There's got to be something scary. And Wes and I really did have a big argument about it. We didn't argue about too much, but we had a big fight about that. So I said, well, let's shoot 3 endings. So he agreed to do that. So we had her walking out of the house and walking into the sunlight. We had the convertible picking her up to go to school, and then the top going up and Freddie driving the car. And then, I don't know, I think it was Wes's idea, we had her being sucked through the door of the house back into the house.
Right.
We didn't know which one to use. So we had little test screenings. We just rented a little screening room on Broadway, and we invited friends and family and stuff to come. So we had screenings of 20 or 30 people to see which ending worked the best. And we couldn't tell. One didn't seem to be any better than the other. So out of desperation, we used them all.
Yeah, it is kind of an amalgam, and they're all available on the Blu-ray, of course.
It actually embarrasses me every time I see that. But on the other hand, people seem to like it, and it seemed to work so well.
It's memorable. And then, of course, that would open the door for sequels. But before you got there, was it an instant success?
Yes, it was an instant success. That was one of the great thrills of my professional life. It opened on downtown on Broadway in New York, and in one of those big sort of like commercial barns. And I remembered going down to the theater to get the audience reaction. And I've never had this, well, I have had it with Sympathy of the Devil because of the Rolling Stones and Reefer Madness, of course, but I've never seen a line like that waiting out in front come in to see the movie.
The first Nightmare on Elm Street was obviously a huge hit, and from a financial point of view, so was part 2. However, the second movie wasn't written or directed by Wes Craven, and it did not fare as well with the fans, apart from a particular subset, that is. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Craven was really out of the picture at that point. He declined and did not want to be a part of any sequels. And so we moved ahead because we frankly didn't have any other material that was worthy of a sequel, and we didn't have anything particularly exciting that had the momentum that Elm Street had. After the second one came out, there were a couple of things that happened. One, we realized that we made Freddy Krueger, particularly at the end, when he popped out at the swimming pool scene, too much like a regular person. And that sort of diminished a lot the sort of like scariness of a monster that was in your dream. That was one thing that happened. And the film also, very parenthetically, gained a kind of gay following because there turned out to be a lot of material in it that could be taken as a sort of gay subtext. That didn't keep us from making more movies, but that wasn't necessarily the objective of this thing.
Speaking of the gay subtext, you of course are immortalized forever in leather in that film. A few people involved said, oh yeah, we knew about it, and some people say we don't. What's the truth? Was it really kind of meant to be that way, or was it something that was completely done without your knowledge?
It was the weirdest thing. You know, when I look at the film now and I see the shower scene and me getting dressed up in rough leather clothes as the bartender, I mean, it was all just by accident. And Jack Shoulder, when you talk to him, you can ask him about it. He never acknowledged to me. And I was naive in the sense that I didn't have any particular agenda to enhance the film with a particular interest. I guess there was a gay contingent in the cast, and I suppose in the production altogether, that maybe steered it, but that sounds too insidious. I think it just sort of grew out of whole cloth. It just came that way. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but afterwards we found out that prints of the film had the gay moments, particularly when it was the signally gay moment, which I had no clue whatsoever, and I don't think Jack did. I mean, both of us are quite straight, so it's not about we had any sort of hidden agenda. But when Freddy Krueger comes out of the body of the guy who plays the lead, and he, I believe, had sort of a personal story to tell too, but it just never occurred to us that there was any subtext there, but there obviously was. That scene was one of the ones that was cut out of the prints of the film, and I've been told sort of circulated sub rosa in certain circles.
Right.
But we had no clue, let me just say that definitively.
While the second movie did decent at the box office, and it does have its fans to this day, it didn't create much demand or excitement for a possible third movie. How did you overcome that?
We were somewhat stymied by the lack of momentum that the second one created. So what really happened, I think, is that Chuck Russell came to us with a proposal, and he had some really good ideas. And I actually do remember a meeting with him at Chateau Marmont when he was pitching the whole thing, where he came up with this really great stuff that ended up in the third version that incentivized us and convinced us that there was still a story and exciting theme to be pursued here that the fans would appreciate, and hoped that they weren't turned off by the faux pas that we made on the second film. And that was how and why we progressed.
Between Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and Nightmare on Elm Street 2, you guys did have some other films come out. One in particular that was kind of a success for you guys, especially on home video, was Critters. How did Critters come about?
That's a good story. First of all, the Joe Dante movie that came before was sort of the precursor to Critters. But what happened was that Roger Corman wanted to make a film like that, and we heard about the Critters script. Steve Herrick was an editor for Corman, and he was slated to be the director of Critters. And Corman and New Line got into a bit of a bidding war, and it's the thing that I've encountered many times. Not really my particular skills, but we had to really sort of sell Rupert and Barry Opper, who was the other producer, kind of a bill of goods that we were the right guys for the movie, and that New World wasn't going to handle it with the same sort of finesse and originality that we hoped to bring to it. So we won that little skirmish, and they went with us to produce the film.
Right, and speaking of Gremlins beforehand, Critters is one that actually stands out above the other quote-unquote rip-offs because, well, the script did exist before Gremlins existed. You guys didn't spend a bunch of money, but it looked like you did, and not only that, it was a well-made film. That's the most important thing, and that's one thing New Line has always managed to do, is make movies that Hollywood doesn't really think there's an audience for, but you guys were kind of ahead of the curve.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. We've always tried to our money's worth on the screen. There's an interesting little anecdote, which nobody knows. I'll share it with you right now about Critters. What happened was, at the end of the movie, the home of our family gets blown up by the Critters. And we had some test screenings that were okay. I mean, everybody loved, we had a really good cast. So anyhow, I brought to the test screening, the last test screening we had before we locked the movie, a guy who was going to direct a movie for us called Quiet Cool. Clay Boris and I are sitting watching this movie. And the movie ends, and he says, and he's a Canadian guy, he's actually French-Canadian. But we got to be really good friends. And so I said, "What'd you think, Clay?" And he said, "I thought it was a pretty good movie." But he said, the fact that the house blows up at the end is such a downer. It really, it's just a terrible way to end the movie. So I started thinking about it, and I said, well, how about if we have the house come back together? So that's a pretty good idea. I went to Rupert and to Barry Opper, the producers, and said, we have to reshoot this. Totally correct. It's a downer. It doesn't work. So we actually rebuilt the house. I don't remember whether it was must have been a miniature. I don't remember exactly how we did it.
I think it was a miniature, yes.
But we made the whole house come back together to sort of add a upbeat note to the end of the movie. And the film worked quite well, so I'm rather proud of it. There were some funny moments. I mean, one particular where we didn't want to get an R rating, but you were allowed one fuck in the movie. And so that was one critter saying to the other, when Wallace shoots the shotgun at him, the critter says, fuck.
Yeah.
And that always got a big laugh from the audience. That was a funny moment. Thanks for reminding me about that. I mean, I get a little chill just thinking about it. But it was one of those great things that happens when you're making movies, that somebody, hopefully it's you, but it's not always you when you're the producer, comes up with a brilliant idea to just turn things around. At least it was brilliant at that time and place to take it to the place where it ought to be.
Wise man say forgiveness is divine, but never pay full price for late pizza.
How did Ninja Turtles come to New Line?
It's a really long and fascinating story, but I'll tell you a little bit. I knew who Raymond Chow was because 15 years previous, when we were just handling little tiny art films, and I was in Cannes actually with Werner Herzog watching some stupid movie, and it was Director's Fortnight, and we're sitting watching this movie, and I said, why don't we go out and see a movie that I just read about in the Film Francais, which is the daily newspaper for the Cannes Film Festival, that was supposed to be the biggest hit ever in Hong Kong. So he said, okay, let's go see that. So we jumped out, we went to see Bruce Lee's first big success, Fist of Fury. And that's a whole other story, which I won't get into right now. But anyhow, we made a deal for that film and for Big Boss, which was this other movie that he had made then. And Raymond Chow was the producer, and he reneged on our deal and sold it to somebody else, because the truth is he wanted $50,000 for it as an advance, and I didn't have $50,000 in my bank account then. So we lost that. But there was always that thing about Raymond Chow. And Raymond Chow was also the producer of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And I'd heard about it, but they didn't even deign to offer it to us. It was being shown all over town to everybody, and everybody turned it down. And what happened, in the same way that I acknowledged the skills and the taste of the people who I was working with, my colleagues, Sarah Risher, who at that time was head of our little production and development division, as well as Mitch Goldman, who at that time was head of our domestic distribution, which was popping right along, both came into my office and said, you got to go after this film. I said, well, what is it? I never heard of these guys. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the biggest thing, and both of them had kids who were like 7 or 8 years old, who both realized from their kids that this was a hugely hot product. And everybody had turned it down. So in fact, I think Mitch Goldman, when he came into my office, he said, listen, I will sign a oath with the blood of my finger that says that we are going to make money off this movie. I mean, it was just sort of an anecdotal way. So anyhow, we bought it. And that was how it came to be. And of course, the bitter irony of the whole thing is that Miramax, later on, after we gave up the franchise, they picked it up. They came out with a film on exactly the same weekend that my film, The Last Mimsy, came out, that I thought was going to be a big hit, and they completely creamed us. So you have to look at life as ironic.
So then how did that success change New Line? Because at the time, it was the biggest independent film of all time until Blair Witch a few years later.
Yeah, well, it was great. I remember calling up our head of distribution on Friday night and saying, how are we doing? He said, you can't believe it, but we're going to do $10 million on Friday. And I didn't believe it. And actually, Steve Tisch took me out to lunch on Saturday to the Ivy. It looks like it's going to be a $25 million weekend for you guys, which was an incredible achievement. And I was completely floored. It was unbelievable.
So by now, New Line was gradually starting to enter the big leagues. So after some acquisitions of your own, the Turner Broadcasting System wanted to acquire you. How did that come about?
Well, I still wanted to be a director. I was getting myself really mired into the business world, the sort of a dubious business world of being a distributor, an independent distributor. And it was fine. I mean, we were making a living and we were having fun making some films that I was really proud of and that I think that I had some participation in creating. But we just didn't want to be, another little independent producer distributor. So we started looking for financing and bigger and better material. But we finally had a bank line and there was like $100 million or something. So we had money to spend. Of course, we had to earn it back, to pay it back, to continue with the banking facility. But we were more ambitious about where we were and where we could go in the industry. And a whole other story, much longer than I think we can engage in here. But we had an investment banker who was helping us raise money, and not only through bank financing, but through bonds and convertible debentures and subsequent stock offerings and stuff like that. But at one point, that investment banker came to us and said, would you like to go and meet Ted Turner? And I had been interested in meeting Ted Turner for a long time because I thought that he was really an interesting, quixotic guy. And he was a star client of Drexel Burnham, which was a investment banking house, which was the house that was very well known actually for all of the scandal that went on there. But they were very famous for initiating and for pursuing financing with so-called junk bonds, which were bonds that raised money and had a very high interest rate, but were usually raised money for organizations that, for one reason or another, was a little bit more difficult, a bit more dubious than regular bond financing. And in any event, Ted was one of their clients. And Drexel had invited me to several of the so-called, in a book that was later published, they were called the Predators' Balls, where they had these big 3 and 4 day conferences with all of their clients who came to these fancy dinners and et cetera, et cetera. I was probably the lowest man on the totem pole at all of these things. They were all guys that were very, very successful, or some of whom were scam artists and some of whom were legitimately successful. But there I was, just a guy who didn't belong there at all, suddenly going to the Predators' Balls. But the one guy that really impressed me, because he just seemed like such a maverick, was Ted. So my partner and I, who at that time, I think he was my lawyer at that point, Michael Lynn, and I went to Atlanta to meet Ted Turner. And we fly to Atlanta. I was a little surprised that there wasn't a limo to meet us at the airport, but we had to take a cab to his office, but that was okay. And so we went to Ted's office, and he was there with a couple of his cronies, and sat and talked for about a half hour. And Ted said at one point, well, okay, let's do it. And I didn't exactly say what I thought. What I thought was, what the hell is he talking about? But I said to my partner and investment banker who I was with, let's step out for a second. So we stepped out, and I said, what the fuck is he talking about? He said, well, maybe he really wants to make a business deal. So I said, well, I didn't know that's what we were coming here for. And he said, well, it's a possibility. So I went back in and I said, I don't know. What's your thought? So he said, let's do this and let's get it together. Let's see if we can't make a partnership. And so I said, well, okay, let me talk to my colleagues and we'll get back to you. So we got back on the airplane and came back to New York, and I said, well, maybe this is serious. Maybe we should try to do something. I had never thought about what effectively was selling the company. I mean, there was no question about it. It was totally selling the company, but it was characterized as a merger, and it was going to be a partnership and all this stuff. So I said, well, let's explore it. So we did explore it. Ted and I met several times. He came to my house. I made him lunch, talked about things. And at one point I said, listen, Ted, we may want to make films that are like $30 or $35 million. What's your thoughts about that? And he said, listen, Bob, he said, I don't care. You can make a movie for $70 million for all I care. That's the way I want you to do it. He said, I just want you to swing for the bleachers every time. But of course, I want you to make some money in the process. But you have carte blanche. And when he said that, and the whole persona of the guy was so much in my school, and I was so alienated and confounded and actually never invited into the real brotherhood of movie makers in Hollywood, that here was a guy in Atlanta who was into all kinds of crazy stuff and was a bit profane and totally cool, that I could really see as being a possible partner. And then I began to think, could I ever turn New Line into a billion-dollar company? And I just couldn't see the way. We had some money. It wasn't, I mean, we were successful, but I didn't see how to go to take step B in the process. And it seemed to me having a guy with that kind of attitude, even at my modest way, was my kind of guy, I thought. I mean, at least I felt more akin to him than these sort of iconic names, that I said, well, maybe it's something I should do. Otherwise, I'm going to be jerking around from one bank financing to another, and I couldn't see a way to do anything that was really kind of imaginative from a corporate point of view. And so I said, yeah, okay, let's do it. And it happened. We acted like any subsidiary of any big company. We had a corporate meeting once a year, particularly our budget meeting. We presented a budget. We reviewed how we did the previous year, and we talked about what was going on, and it was always with the key people at Turner and with our key people. And every year we made a lot of money for the combined company, and every year we got our budget approved without any problems. And it was a really salutary, kind of a healthy environment that worked out for everybody. And Ted was not a corporate guy by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I wasn't either. So we had a kind of weird kinship that I quite enjoyed. We really had a lot of fun. I mean, I don't know how he really thought about me. I still thought about me as an employee. He even made a comment to somebody, because I have a pretty nice place in Los Angeles anyhow, that, you got to be careful not to treat your employees too generously. Otherwise, they'll quit and go and do something else. But anyhow, he was the guy who quit eventually, and that's another story. But that was really how we segued into bigger films and bigger budgets. Also, part of it was that the company was going so well. It was so well oiled at that point that we had a very effective and important international sales organization that was selling our pictures, the biggest of the independent companies internationally. And so we had a great network of guys who had money and had a great distribution organization in their own right that were very much our partners. And we had a very good development team. Mike DeLuca was doing a terrific job, and everybody under him was doing a great job. And we were just sailing along, that having the financial opportunity to make what we wanted to make was just in the cards. And the first film that came after the merger was not really one that I was jumping up and down about, but we had our international sales guys and the home video guys. Everybody had their own little bailiwick, and they all kind of, like, I wouldn't say ganged up on me, but they all rang in on this idea, let's do something really big to announce that we're really doing something. So we went out and paid $4.5 million for the script for Long Kiss Goodnight. It was never in a million years I had ever imagined paying $4.5 million for anything. But this was a script that I think Rennie Harlan brought to us, and that Shane Black had written. And we paid $4.5 million for a script. But because it wasn't like we had to go and raise money for it, we had the money. It was all perfect. And we had Gina Davis starring in it. So that was really when we changed our sights. We went by Ted's mandate, swing for the bleachers.
Today, comic book movies dominate Hollywood. That wasn't always the case though. Yet, when hardly anyone else did, New Line put out comic book movies like The Mask, Spawn, and even Marvel's Blade. How were you able to see the inherent potential in this, when so many of your peers in other studios didn't?
There's several things. One, it was about what I thought my own instincts were, but I put a lot of faith into our team. And I've always been a big believer in listening to people, and not just having a kind of arrogance about, I don't care, this is what I think is going to work. And sometimes I've shot myself in the foot with that philosophy, but more than not, that philosophy about paying a little bit of attention to the rest of the world, who are my customers, has served me well. And I've always been a big comic book fan. I never really directly set my sights on going to get comic book material. Mike DeLuca was actually he's a younger version, and he was a big comic book fan too. He's the one who found The Mask, for instance, along with Chuck Russell. I mean, that's one of the great things about being in the movie business. Nobody has a monopoly on creativity. Nobody has a monopoly on understanding the taste of the public. And so you don't need to come from a fancy family or have a whole bunch of money in principle. What you need to do is to be able to have insight and inspiration to want to work hard to entertain people. If you like to entertain people, if you like to cook for people, if you like to dance for people, if you like to sing for people, if you like to do stuff like that, you're doing it for the rest of the world. And if you have those sensibilities, whatever it is, and if you have talent to stand behind your desire, that's all that's required.
Speaking of The Mask, 1994 was kind of the year of Jim Carrey and New Line simultaneously. Jim Carrey, of course, had Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. The latter two of the three were released by you guys, New Line Cinema. How did those projects come about?
Now, when I saw Jim Carrey on the HBO show that he had, he was so crazy. It was actually Chuck Russell who promoted him. It's starring in The Mask.
Right, because Ace Ventura had not come out yet.
No, it had. He signed on to The Mask, and we said, yeah, let's do it. I just thought the guy was perfect. He was a wonderful guy to work with. He was reasonably humble. He was certainly not arrogant, and he just got out there and did his job. And he did things that were just so unbelievable. So much of the movie was ad-libbed that he was just the perfect guy for the part. I mean, so was Cameron. I mean, the whole movie just was kind of magical. I have to say it's one of my favorite films that we embarked on. And that was Jim Carrey. I mean, Jim Carrey, we paid him $750,000 for The Mask. And then when Dumb and Dumber came along, that's a whole other story, which I will not get into right now. But we had an option for a second film with Jim, and we decided to do something very Hollywood. And we wrote a letter to his lawyer exercising our option for a second film and published it in Variety. And his agents called up and said, forget it, he's not doing it, and you can sue him forever. And so we ended up having to pay him $7.5 million for Dumb and Dumber. But of course, that was also a wise investment because he was equally excellent in that. That was just the perfect combination also.
What was it like playing yourself in New Nightmare? I know you said you had aspirations to be an actor, so was this finally your chance?
Yeah, but I did not have aspirations to do that.
Yeah, as I was going to say, then you play yourself.
Well, Wes and I think it was more Wes and New Line, because it wasn't so much me personally, but had a somewhat contentious relationship after Elm Street did so much money, and then he wanted to be a part of it, and his agent had made a deal that didn't include a very significant participation in the sequels or anything. Anyhow, we got it all straightened out. He was happy, I was happy, actually good friends. And then he called me up several years later, I don't even remember what the time frame was, but said, I have this new idea, are you interested? And so, sure, it tickled my acting nerve a little bit. I was also a bit surprised, and I wasn't quite sure how the film was going to really work. It was a little bit before its time, I think. The timing is also a factor in entertainment. But I thought it came out very well. I mean, I cringe when I see my performance. It definitely is one of the things that has turned me off acting subsequent to that turn on the screen. But I'm glad we did it, and it was a great coda to the series.
How did Lord of the Rings come to your attention, and what motivated you to take on such a huge responsibility of sorts, and what brought you to the decision to do it as 3 movies?
Well, it came to my attention when I read that Miramax was going to do it. I thought it was a great idea. I'm sorry it was one of those ones that we missed. I mean, Harvey and I had been at each other's throats pretending to be gentlemen all through our careers. And we got some and he got some. And every time he got some, I got aggravated. And every time I got some, he probably was aggravated. But again, everybody turned it down in town. And I wasn't particularly interested in it, but when they wanted to make a pitch, I said I'll listen to it. And when they made the pitch, I thought it was really very, very impressive. I thought that the package itself had incredible possibilities. I wasn't so sure about the director, but Peter was a nice guy. I had known him for a while, and I didn't know whether he could manage to do it, but we were having a terrible time, in my mind, in our production activities. I thought Mike DeLuca had kind of was veering off into non-commercial material, and we weren't really getting along that well together, and it just wasn't a very solid association anymore. and we desperately needed product that we could sell. It was always the international side that was firing up our production activities because we needed films. And so the guy who was head of international, Rolf Mitwig, would come back to us and say, why don't we do this? Why don't we do that? When we had divisional meetings every month so everybody could hear what it was that we were thinking about. When he heard about Lord of the Rings, he was very enthusiastic and said, you could definitely sell it. Now I can get most of the money for it out of international. And then when I heard that Peter was only looking for money for 2 films, I was anxious to make 3. I would have made 5 if there was 5 books, because we didn't have anything else that had that sort of momentum built into it. And so we sent a very confident production team to New Zealand to see what Peter wanted to do. He said that films were going to cost $60 to $70 million each. He had no clue what they were going to cost, really. And so we came back with a realistic estimate, which the first film was like $125 million, but we had the money and we didn't have any product. We were part of a big organization, and I felt reasonably confident that this was going to happen. I did have a moment of abject fear and depression when I went to New Zealand the first time to see assembly of some of the footage that Peter had done and just what was going on there. And I saw in the screening room that they had posters from his previous movies, which included Meet Feebles and Brain Dead and stuff like that. And I said, holy fuck, what's this all about? I'd seen the films. I mean, it just hadn't occurred to me that he had only made one interesting film in his entire life, which I thought was Heavenly Creatures, but that was an art film. And I loved it. I thought it was really a great movie, but I didn't see how you could extrapolate from that to Lord of the Rings. As Shakespeare said, the fat was in the fire, and so we pulled it out.
Right, because anybody looking in would be like, you're crazy. You got this guy who's only made one studio movie that basically flopped, and that was The Frighteners.
Right.
And you're doing 3 movies instead of 2 all at once, and instead of just trying one movie to see if it works first, which now they do all the time in Hollywood. They plan 5 movies ahead.
Right. No, I've heard many people say that I was a complete asshole. That's exactly what they thought. That I was going to take the company, but they didn't understand that in point of fact, that we had like 80% of the budget covered from the get-go. We pre-sold that film, and given the tax deals that came along with it, almost 80% of the entire budget, even at $125 million. And all of the people we sold it to had to take all 3 films. They were all financially competent. They could put up the money. They were all international. And so it was really that whether the film came out good, it was really domestic. It was our upside. And it was honestly, at the time, it was not like, oh my God, what am I going to do? This is like it could be a death knell. It was like a no-brainer. The worst that could happen, which could have happened, was that the first film was a piece of crap, and that the other 2 films would virtually not be releasable, and that's where we could lose some serious money. But it was not as crazy as it sounded. I mean, I suppose, in terms of huge success, it could have gone in the other direction, but it could not have gone into abject failure because, as I told you, we had basically the budget required covered. And so it was a little bit more of a reasoned business decision than just the sort of, let's go out and make movies.
After you stepped down with the Warner merger in 2008, you've still been working. You have a couple projects coming up. One's called Are We Not Men? What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's from a short story that T.C. Boyle wrote that I read in New Yorker, and I had actually brushed shoulders with him culturally by reading his book of short stories before, just coincidentally. And it was the perfect short story in the sense that, as Hitchcock once said to Truffaut in the interviews that were published, that good movies that have their origin literary works usually come from great short stories or bad novels. And The Birds, which is one of my favorite Hitchcock movies, was from a Daphne du Maurier short story, and this was like about nature gone crazy. So we bought it. We got Mike Cahill to write and direct it. We sold it to Hulu, and we're just waiting for the development process to continue, actually. And I'm hoping that it'll be a limited 10-part series. We won't hear for a while, but Hulu makes their decisions in April in terms of picking up the development, and I'm hoping that it'll be successful. We're very excited about the pilot that Mike has written. Hulu's excited about it. It's a terrific story. It involves gene editing and the things that are very au courant right now in the news about creating hybrid children out of gene editing technology and how things go awry. I don't want to tell you too much about it, but I know Mike Cahill is an extremely capable director. We're quite good friends. And the special effects, I think, are going to be a word I rarely use, but I think they're going to be awesome. And I think the story is going to be great. And I think we're going to get an excellent cast. And I'm very enthusiastic about it. And another project which I'm also extremely enthusiastic about, because I am interested in cooking, and I think cooking and being a dinner host is very much like making movies and being a distributor, frankly. And this is called amuse-bouche, which in French means playing with your mouth. And it's romance and a murder mystery that's bound up in the world of cooking. And that's all I can say about it right now. And I'm not exactly sure who we're going to end up making a deal with, but there are several of the usual suspects who are buzzing around us trying to make a deal with us. So that's the two things. And then, as I told you, I just finished directing a film which I'm quite enthusiastic about, which is right now called, I think, Deadly Ambition. We're still toying with the title, which stars very talented and attractive young actress named Catherine Hughes and Sonoya Mizuno, who is co-starring with it, and a guy named Giles Matthey, an English actor who's also extremely talented, all of whom have appeared in different things. Mizuno is in Maniac right now on Netflix and was in Deus Ex Machina. And it starts off as being a very kind of formal story about a bunch of kids living together and a girl who wants to be a virtuoso on the concert stage. It turns into a murder mystery, and as I said, it's meant to be a puzzle that has a big surprise at the end, and quite enthusiastic about it. I think it's going to be distributed by Shout Factory, and I think it's coming out the second quarter, so it's probably April or May. And also, we're co-producing a film with Paul McCartney called The High in the Clouds. Paul has written 8 original songs for it. It's an animated film that is being co-produced with us by Gaumont, the French company. And also, we have a 4-part series that we have sold and is going into production to Netflix called Liberator, which is from the true story about a division of the U.S. Navy that started off in Enzio Beach and ended up being the first American arrivals to liberate Buchenwald. And it's being shot by a company called One World in Atlanta that uses an animation technique that is quite like graphic novels. Not animated, it uses real actors, but the actors are recreated technically to look like drawings more than real people. And the reason that we're doing that is because all the backgrounds and all the battle scenes and stuff like that are created digitally, and they're varied to the actors. It's quite like, although it's much more of a comfortable feel to the animation that's in video games, like Grand Theft Auto, for instance. And so it has a verisimilitude that you totally buys into, but the production process is a little bit less complicated than actually having warships shooting guns at each other and stuff like that, which was prohibitive even for Netflix.
In other words, many cool upcoming projects to look forward to there, which we can't wait to learn more about as they approach release. Till then, I would like to thank you, Bob Shaye, for sharing your experiences and your insights with us and our viewers.
Thank you. All the best. Look forward to hearing further from you soon.
All right, thank you, sir. Take care.
Okay, my friend. Take care.
If you like this video, then please help share it and share your opinion in the comments. Midnight's Edge aims to give the most comprehensive analysis and commentary on genre culture and entertainment. If you would like to see more of our videos, then please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and remember to indicate that you would like to be notified when new videos are uploaded. If you really like what we do, then please support us on Patreon until a better alternative comes along, or send us a direct donation through PayPal. Also check out our sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark for live shows and other rants. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and stay tuned for more here at Midnight's Edge.